Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. In this episode, we talk with Andrei Buckareff about a kind of a soft-line response to the manipulation argument that draws from work within the philosophy of action.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Andrei Buckareff, professor of philosophy and co-director of the cognitive science program at Marist College in New York. A lot of Andrei's work centers around the metaphysics of causal powers and how work on that subject bears on issues in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of agency. Andrei has too many publications for me to mention now, but for listeners who are interested, I'd encourage you to check out his website, where you'll find more information about his writing, his current projects, and even some pieces he's written on philosophy and skateboarding and on philosophy and beer brewing. So welcome to the show, Andrei. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Taylor and Matt. So I think like a lot of people, particularly people who come from certain religious backgrounds, my initial interest in free will came from being sort of puzzled by, rendered uneasy by problems about providence and freedom. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about, right, particularly, in my late teens, at that time I was a traditional theist. I was an evangelical. I went to Biola University, and I was thinking about, right, sort of traditional omni-God theism. God has exhaustive foreknowledge, right? God is also regarded as being, right, as exercising, riskless providence and so on. And so because of that, I started thinking about puzzles about free will. And my focus initially, say, my first year in college and so on, was primarily just with those theological problems. Mm-hmm. But as time went on, and I was initially just reading historical sources, so I was reading people like Augustine of Hippo and people like that. And but then in my junior year, there was a seminar on free will that was offered taught by David Chalky, who was a professor of mine there, and J.P. Moreland. And that course was probably a real turning point for me, because then I just started thinking about free will more broadly, right, as a general problem. Yeah. And I wasn't as focused on it as being this problem about, divine activity in the world and divine knowledge and our free agency. And so I started then getting into the problem more generally. And also what happened in that course was I started getting introduced to more fundamental issues in action theory. Because one of the readings that we read large parts of Alvin Goldman's book, Theory of Action.
Oh, yeah.
And that was Chalky, actually, in particular, who felt it was important that we the people in the course, and it was a mixture of graduate students and undergraduates. It was a mixed course. And I was actually one of only, I think, maybe 2 undergraduates in that class. And this was about 20 people in there. And I'm in that class and I'm starting to read Goldman and starting to think a little bit more about, right, how these sorts of problems are related to one another. That's to say, problems about intentional action more broadly and problems about free will, and how the answers that you come to when it comes to one set of questions could inform how you're thinking about the other set of questions. Mm-hmm. More specifically, about how you're thinking about intentional action may or may not have an impact on what your options are going to be, or will have an impact, I should say, on certain options when it comes to thinking about free will. So now fast forward a few years, I thought I was going to become an Episcopal priest. So along the way, I became an Episcopalian and started divinity school, actually. And about a week into divinity school, I realized I was not priest material, and that really my interests in theology were really more philosophical in orientation. And so I completed a master's degree in theology with a concentration in philosophical theology, and then immediately just went back to philosophy. Because as an undergraduate, I was thinking of becoming, right, some kind of a cleric, and it became quickly about thinking about becoming an Episcopal priest. By my sophomore year, I was not thinking about, well, what courses do I need to be taking in order to do well in graduate school in philosophy? So I felt the best option for me was to go to a master's program. I was talked into this by John Quanvig, who was the graduate chair at Texas A&M at the time. So I had some offers at some PhD programs, some of which were better than others, but he assured me that I would be better off if I went and did a master's degree first. And I thought, okay, I'll do it. So I did, because they gave me a good offer too, for what it's worth. And so I went to A&M, originally actually thinking that I would work with Quanvig on topics in epistemology or possibly in philosophy of religion. Mm-hmm. But it didn't take very long for me to start realizing that I was really most interested in problems in philosophy of mind and philosophy of agency in general. And so when I first started there, I was primarily working with Colin Allen, who works in philosophy of mind, but then because Hugh McCann was on a sabbatical, but then during my second semester there, Hugh came back and we started talking, and one thing led to another, and I found that we had a lot of shared interests, and I decided to work with him, and so I decided to do my master's thesis with Hugh McCann on free will, and on agent causation more specifically. And again, under McCann, I sort of continued along the pathway that I had started with working with, say, David Chalky, which was thinking much more about foundational questions in action theory and how they would then inform some of these debates about free will. And I decided to stick with the free will debate primarily at that point, just because it was just terrain that I knew better. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, but much of what was going on in that thesis was contrasting a sort of a theory of free will that is based on a causal theory of action, and contrasting that with agent causal approaches. And so, and in that paper, in that thesis, there's a really unoriginal proposal at the end, which is just Kahnean, and it's just basically just Robert Kane's theory of free agency. Yeah. With a few little twists in it, but nothing terribly original at the end. Most of it was really just the critique of agent causalism. So then I went to my PhD program at University of Rochester and decided to work on mental action and focused on our agency informing beliefs. But then I did a few papers on mental action when I was there that were going to be chapters, which I was told to take out. What's funny about the chapters that were just on mental action in general, and some general puzzles about mental action, is that one of those papers is one of my most cited papers, and it was an outtake. It wasn't even something that I ended up including in the original, in the final draft, rather, of the dissertation. Yeah. So I wrote on mental agency, and so I was working on that stuff for a few years. But while I was there at Rochester, I worked with Richard Feldman, and Rich has a lot of interest in free will, and so I got to continue to just explore some of these issues, while exploring, digging deeper into issues in the philosophy of action. So the dissertation was really broadly about philosophy of agency, focusing on mental agency, in particular agency in forming beliefs and so on. But while I'm there, I'm working with Rich Feldman quite a bit and taking a seminar with him on free will, and we did some directed readings. And then he and I wrote a paper together, which was one of my first publications, which was a criticism. It was a discussion note on Tim O'Connor's theory of reasons explanations. Oh, yeah. And so that was, again, a sort of nice paper that allowed me to sort of think about the intersection between these issues about free agency and how they relate to broader issues in philosophy of action about reasons explanations. Mm-hmm. And so Rich and I were critiquing Tim's account, in particular arguing that we should understand the reasons that are figuring in the explanations of agency of actions as being, mental causes in the sense of efficient causes, not just structuring causes, the way that he talks about. And so he raised a few difficulties. It was a fun paper to write. But the nice thing, again, about my time at Rochester was it allowed me just to continue on with those interests. And Rich, again, to this day, is somebody that I like to talk to about these things, because in some ways he kind of has the perspective of someone who has a lot of interesting things to say about the free will debates, yet who's in a lot of ways very much of an outsider, given that he hasn't contributed as much. But the contributions that he's made, I think, have been quite rich, no pun intended. But so in any case, so continued on, and then after that, once you finish graduate school, you kind of mine your dissertation to death. And actually, I just finished mining it to death.
Nice.
I just published. There was a piece that I was sitting on that was my own original proposal about exercising a form of control over our beliefs, and that paper finally found a home recently. So
Nice.
and was published.
Well done.
Yeah, 16, 17, how many years? Gosh, 18 years later. 18 years later. Anyhow, so that's for those of you who are having difficulty getting stuff published. Have hope. Eventually, you'll find a home for things.
Yeah, keep up with it.
Yeah.
Nice.
But yeah, so then subsequent to that, then I started to just focus again more on issues in the metaphysics of agency and free agency. But then along the way, right? So I finished my PhD, and then there's another sort of important step for me, which was in 2009. I was telling Taylor about this. I was in a NEH seminar that was run by John Heil, and at that seminar there were two important occurrences. One was meeting Jonathan Jacobs, who's at St. Louis University, and Jonathan Lowe spent a week with us at that seminar. And I'll say something about Jonathan Jacobs. And John was a student of Tim O'Connor's at Indiana University, and he has a lot of interest in agency and free will. And in fact, he wrote a fantastic paper with Tim that was in a volume on mental causation, on agent causalism, that I think is one of the best pieces on the topic. But in any case, so John and I were talking one time, and I was complaining about people working on free will who don't want to pay attention to foundational questions in action theory. And then he said, yeah, but what about people who work on action theory who don't want to think seriously about more fundamental questions in metaphysics? And I was like, oh yeah, touche. And so that was really sort of not to say I was uninterested in other questions, but there were these, the way that I was about causation about that time, I was somebody who was a proponent of a version of the causal theory of action, and it was just a just so story, right? You just you just tell this kind of, you help yourself to, you stay quiet about questions about whether causes are producing outcomes or they're difference makers. You don't get into the how questions about causation. It's just the why or the what, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And there's not really those sort of bigger questions, if you will, or getting deeper was something that I just hadn't done. And so John, that conversation with John was one of those ones where I thought, wow, I probably need to buckle down a bit here and be a little more ontologically serious, to use language that John Heil liked to use.
Yeah.
And that led then to discussions with Jonathan Lowe. So Jonathan Lowe, I was sort of a thorn in his flesh because, he's this like anti-causalist, if you will. And he has this, he thinks that substance causation is a more fundamental sort of notion than any other sort of way of thinking about causation and so on. And so we were arguing quite a bit, and but the end result of our arguments was I started to actually appreciate his perspective a great deal more. That doesn't mean I signed on, but I started to appreciate that this was somebody who was really thinking very hard about what's going on, right, when we're exercising agency. And for him, all of these questions were tied up ultimately with our conception of ourselves as free and rational agents, right? And I had never really appreciated the way that he came at these questions before. I should say this: I never liked his answers. But then what happened was, I as a result of engaging with Jonathan Lowe, I began to appreciate his work so much more because of how he was arriving at the answers, right? Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that ended up being having a really important influence on my work and where it's at today, was talking to people like Lowe and John Heil. And prior to that, some people like John Bishop, who's had a huge influence on me, both before I met him and subsequent to that. I met him when I was in graduate school, and he's been an ongoing sort of influence on my thinking. But people like him and Randy Clark and some other folks, Helen Stewart, there's a whole bunch of people that come to mind, Helen Beebe, right? These folks are really thinking very hard about sort of these broader metaphysical issues and the connection between like how they're thinking about free agency and how they're thinking about some of other problems in metaphysics, particularly questions surrounding the metaphysics of causation. And again, I think before I started having these encounters with people or really taking seriously what they were doing, I just thought we could science the hell out of everything. You know what I mean? So we could if we just do enough cognitive science, we'll get it all figured out, right? And there's a lot of that actually in my dissertation. Much to the chagrin, I'll just note, of Richard Feldman. I mean, Rich was not a methodological naturalist of any sort, and whereas I was, at least, I remember saying I was a modest one, but at that time I wasn't modest. It was very, it was rather immodest in terms of how I was thinking about these matters, and so now, you know, having that 2009 experience of going to that NEH seminar and engaging with people like Jonathan Jacobs and Lowe and Heil, it was really eye-opening in terms of just getting me to think that, look, even if I science it to death, there are still these metaphysical questions when it comes to the scientific framework that I'm working with. And you can't leave these things unanswered. You've got to give it a response to this. And especially if you're not a raging pragmatist or something like that,
Right.
It's not going to be very satisfying, which I'm not. So, right, here I'm this alleged realist, right, about these sorts of, you know, questions and approaches, right, to dealing with questions in the sciences. And yet I was, the way that I was approaching them wasn't really, was not in a way, I think, that ultimately ended up lending itself to making, right, a sort of realist position seem even remotely tenable, right? Because there's all these questions, right? Things you're taking for granted, namely that causation is this real thing in the world. Well, there's all these problems about causation that you end up running into, and if you don't have an answer to those, it's not going to help you one bit, right? So you get to all the causal stories in the world. So I realized that sciencing things to death wasn't the way to go. So I abandoned this sort of hardcore scientism as a result of that. And I think the end result, hopefully the net result of that, has been positive. At least I hope. I like to think it has been. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyways, that's a long way for me to answer your question of how I get and where I've been.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see how people come to the area where they're doing their work.
Yeah. And some of your recent work explores how more foundational work in metaphysics, what we've been talking about, in intentional agency and metaphysics of causation, bears on these issues. And you've used, in particular, your work on this in a response to the manipulation argument against compatibilism, which is an argument we've talked about in several episodes of the podcast earlier. And you argue that manipulation is relevantly different from ordinary causal determination. So before we get into the details, could you summarize the manipulation argument against compatibilism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best summary of the manipulation argument is Michael McKenna's summary that's in a 2008 paper of his from PPR. Right? So what he says is, look, if somebody's manipulated, right, in some specific way, right, to act, then, right, they don't do that of their own free will, right? They're not morally responsible for doing that. And then, right, what you then take as a second premise would be, right, that an agent who's manipulated in, right, that particular way, right, that there's no relevant difference between what's going on, right, in that case of manipulation and what's happening when you've got a normally functioning agent who is causally determined, right, to do that particular action, who satisfies some, set of compatibilist conditions, right, for exercising free agency. So, right, then, right, a normally functioning agent, right, who does who satisfies certain compatibilist conditions for exercising free agency, doesn't have free agency, right? So, so there's no relevant difference. That's basically, I think, the best way to sort of summarize what's going on with manipulation arguments in general. The target in my paper, though, is Dirk Pereboom's four-case argument, where what he does is he presents a case of where you start with a really strong case of direct manipulation, and then the manipulation becomes a bit weaker and more distant, and it's not proximate manipulation, if you will, and it becomes a sort of distal manipulation, and then it's something that's really like behavioral kind of engineering or something like that, and then it's just causal determinism. And really, the idea there is right. What he asks his reader is, right, show me where there's a relevant difference, right, in terms of these steps, right? So, and the idea is that there isn't. And importantly, I'll just quickly note that the way that Pereboom structures things and other proponents of manipulation arguments is they take it that when we have the manipulation, it's still an agency preserving relation, right? It's just that free agency is what's undermined, right? So they're not saying that an individual is not exercising intentional agency and they're not acting intentionally and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's that the person can be acting intentionally yet not be exercising free agency in so acting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm taking issue with, at least when it comes to cases of direct manipulation. I mean, I could say more about that if you want.
Yeah. Well, my next question was going to be on that exact point. So, you've said in some of your work that in these manipulation cases, when it's direct manipulation, it might even be that intentional agency is undermined. And you compare this sort of manipulation with what goes on in cases of causal deviance, which are commonly discussed cases in the literature on the philosophy of action. Could you say something, maybe describe a case of causal deviance, say something about that, and then explain how that affects intentional agency?
Yeah. So the place to start here, though, actually, is going to be with the causal theory of action, right? So the causal theory of action says that, right, some activity is an intentional action if and only if it's caused in the right way by some appropriate mental items that, causally explain what the person's doing, something to that effect. That's a sort of basic schema for the causal theory of action. Okay, so that in the right way thing ends up becoming really important because prior to 1970 or whenever it was that Davidson wrote his paper Freedom of Action, and before that, in 1966, actually, in a paper by Roderick Chisholm called Freedom and Action, I think that was the title of the paper. We start having these cases of causal deviance that led people who are proponents of the causal theory to add that in the right way part.
Right. Yeah.
So I'll use Davidson's Clymer case because that's probably the most widely discussed case of causal deviance. So Davidson presents this case where somebody satisfies the criteria for acting intentionally that he had articulated. In this case, the person's behavior is caused by some belief desire pair, and the person though isn't acting. So in the case of the climber, you've got somebody who is holding up a weight, right? So let's suppose that they're holding a rope, and on the end of the rope are other climbers who are in a precarious situation where if the climber were to let go, they would all die, and so on. And the climber in question, feeling some strain and not enjoying what they're doing, believes they want to let go of the weight, and they believe that if they release it, they'll feel much better, right? And they'll satisfy their want. And they intend to do so. But, right, the presence of those mental items, right, ends up unnerving them. They become nervous, and they release the rope as a result of that. So notice, in that case, you have these mental causes that end up figuring even in an explanation of why the agent did what they did. Right. Yet it doesn't look like the agent acted intentionally, right, if they acted at all. Right? So that's a case of what we sometimes call basic causal deviance. And those are sometimes contrasted with cases of secondary causal deviance. Sometimes basic causal deviance is also called primary causal deviance. And you could contrast that with secondary causal deviance. Secondary causal deviance are cases where somebody has an intention to do something, let's suppose to bring about a particular outcome more specifically. So let's suppose that you have someone who is, Jonathan Bennett's example, I believe, was of someone who's in a gunfight or something like this, right? So it's the Wild West, and let's suppose that somebody calls you out and you've dishonored them or whatever, and they want to, have a shootout with you at the crack of dawn, and you're not a good shot, and time comes to draw. You shoot your gun, and it just so happens, right, that your bullet ends up bouncing off numerous things, and it doesn't go directly, right? The pathway is not directly to the person at whom you're putatively aiming your gun at, right. But the bullet finds its way to that person, right? So that's a case of secondary deviance, right? In that case, the deviance is happening from the action, if you will, or at least from the bodily movement or the activity that you directly have control over to the intended outcome. Yeah. So the first case, the case of the climber, is a case of basic deviance. That's a case where you've got an action, and the pathway from the mental cause to the action is not the proper pathway. The secondary deviance is the case, of course, where it's things are going haywire and weird, but yet you're lucky and you end up achieving your intended outcome. What I'm interested in are the cases just of basic causal deviance. So, and in particular, so now I'm going to add more here, more verbiage. So, what I'm claiming about cases of manipulation particularly direct manipulation, is that cases involving direct manipulation are at least isomorphic to cases of what are called heteromesial causal deviance, which that's an ugly term. And it
Yeah.
was one that was made up basically by John Bishop in his book Natural Agency, which is a fantastic book, by the way. So, which I would strongly recommend that people couple with Helen Stewart's book, Metaphysics of Freedom.
Oh, okay.
Those two books are natural companions to one another, sort of point and counterpoint, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, so Bishop in his book Natural Agency presents these. He names them, right. He christens these cases of heteromesial causal deviance, where hetero means another, mesial in the middle of, right. So another in the middle of. He never defines it. I just had to figure it out one day. I'm like, okay, hetero. All right, look at the cases, and then somebody's in the middle. All right, so these cases first got presented, to my knowledge, by Christopher Peacock in his book Holistic Explanation. And in there, right, what you have in those sorts of cases, and what all cases of heteromesial causation or heteromesial causal deviance have in common, is that these are cases of basic causal deviance. But in these cases, the agent only acts because of the agency of somebody else, right? So, simple case of this is Peacock's case, right? In Peacock's case, you have some neuroscientist who has the ability to track your brain states and the mental states that are, correlated with or realized by or identical with those brain states, however you want to think about the relationship between brain states and mental states. But they could see, right, that you're in a state of intending to do a particular action. And the neuroscientist, right, has installed some sort of prosthetic within you and presses a button, and you end up doing, right, as you intend. But this is owing to, right, the pressing of the button by this second agent. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so notice in that case, right, in particular, the neuroscientist wants you to do that particular thing. And they're making sure that you do it, right? And that's by they press the button, you do it. All right. So those sorts of cases are standardly taken to be cases where you don't have intentional agency being exercised, right? The person's not acting. Now, really quickly, not all heteromesial causal pathways are clearly deviant, right? So any causal pathway that involves going through something that is not sort of a natural organic part of the agent is going to be a heteromesial pathway, right? It's going through another thing, right? So there's a debate amongst people who, this is in the early 80s, there was a big debate about whether all such heteromesial causal pathways are deviant or not. So people like Miles Brand thought that all of them were deviant. Bishop was, I don't know, he sort of hems and haws a bit about these cases. Certain cases he thinks definitely, others not so much. Like there's a case that he has where somebody, let's say, is holding, two wires, right? And but for they're holding those two wires in place, and right, they have the good faith intention to make sure that you execute your intentions. But for they're holding those wires together, you're not going to be able to execute your intentions ever, right? And right, that kind of case he takes as not being as problematic. Mm-hmm. So Jesus Aguilar offers a sort of reliability constraint, right? Is the pathway a reliable one? If it's a reliable pathway, then it's not going to be deviant, right? And so a lot of how we answer cases about heteromesial causal pathways, is going to affect whether or not we think that they're deviant cases. So, all right, so I'm only interested in the deviant cases. The straightforwardly deviant cases are the ones where you've got another agent and they want you to do something, right? They want you to do a particular thing. And they're reading, right, what's going on in your mind, and they're waiting for the right moment and pressing the button. So now that gets me to where things are isomorphic with what we've got in Paraboom's cases, right? So if you look at Paraboom's case 1, we have this case of Plum, and right, Plum needs to decide whether or not they're going to kill White, right? So, and at the moment that Plum is poised to begin deliberation, right, there's some nefarious neuroscientists press a button, and that strengthens a disposition that Plum has to decide in a particular sort of way, and Plum decides in that way. Okay. So what I'm arguing in my work is that what we have here is a deviant pathway. Specifically, it involves heteromesial causal deviance. Now, why think this? The reason why I think this ends up being a deviant pathway is that, well, let me back up just a little bit. The way that Paraboom describes it in the final version of the case, the most recent version of it, is that this is from his 2022, the free will, the Cambridge element that he did. And so actually, let me back up. In 2014, that was one of the more recent statements of it.
Right.
In the 2014 version of it, he says, right, the manipulators enhance Plum's disposition to reason self-interestedly at the requisite time so that they know, and that's crucial, they know that as a result, it is causally ensured that he will decide to murder White and he will want so to decide. Now, fast forward then to 2022, and right here he says Plum would not have killed White had the neuroscientist not intervened, since his reasoning would not have been sufficiently egoistic to produce this decision, right? So we have now these manipulators who are in a position to ensure a particular sort of outcome. Now, why think that this is a case of heteromesial causal deviance? All right, what's going on here? So, right, standard cases of heteromesial causal deviance, people are talking about overt actions. Typically, it's, so it's going to be, right, bodily activity, not mental actions. And I think this is where I think a lot of people may have missed what was going on. I don't think Paraboom meant, I honestly don't think that he thinks this is, I don't think Dirk thinks this is a case of heteromesial causal deviance. But I think that too much about the cases of heteromesial causal deviance, the way that they've been described, has allowed us, I think, to miss what's going on in these manipulation cases. And a lot of this is going to rest about how we think about this mental action of deciding. So, again, standard case of heteromesial causal deviance, I intend to shoot my gun or whatever, and somebody intervenes, makes sure I shoot the gun. Cool. All right, great. Right? Because now in that case, I have the intention to shoot my gun. What we're talking about now in this case of manipulation is somebody forming an intention to do something instead, right? So forming an intention to do something by deciding. So I assume that a decision is going to be this kind of mental action of forming a decision. And in the way that it's described in the case by Paraboom, it's at least preceded by some deliberation. Now, I take it that in any of these sorts of cases where somebody's deliberating about what to do, and right, they reach a point where they have to decide, or maybe they don't have to, they just reach the conclusion of deliberation naturally. In those sorts of cases, the person is faced with some practical uncertainty, and they have to make up their mind about what to do. In those cases, I take it the person has an intention to make up their mind. So that's where I take it we get, right, this is why this is a case of heteromesial causal deviance. We have an instance of somebody having an intention to make up their mind, and we then have these interveners who are ensuring not only that the person will make up their mind, but will make up their mind in a specific sort of way. And they know that what they're going to do, that's the crucial thing. They know that what they're going to do is going to be sufficient to bring about that outcome. So, and that I think is the most important part about this, because if you look at some of these cases of heteromesial causal deviance, what happens is the other person. So Bishop describes one case where the intervener is in complete control over the motor activity of the agent. But notice in that case, right, again, it's because of, right, what they do that you end up bringing about that particular outcome. But when you look at the description that you get from Peacock, it's just, look, the person intervenes to ensure they know this is going to bring about this outcome. That's it. So I take it what's common to all cases of heteromesial causal deviance is somebody's intervening, and by their intervention, they know that the intervention that they're going to be engaging in is going to be sufficient to bring about the outcome that they want, right? And they know it's going to do it. And because you have that in Paraboom's first case of manipulation, the case of direct manipulation, case 1, it seems to me like there's a really significant difference between that and case 4, where it's just a deterministic causal process. The deterministic causal process is going to be one that doesn't involve any other sort of agent, number one. But importantly, now this is where the metaphysics of causal powers comes in, right? It doesn't involve the activity of any other agent's causal powers, right, playing a role that is going to ensure that things are going to go a particular sort of way. In particular, as I see it, right, the causal processes that are occurring are of different types. One, in a normal case of intentional action, is going to be one where, right, it doesn't have any sort of alien intermediary. It's going to be the agent themselves that is responding to reasons, right, who's deliberating and so on. And, right, it's not going to be, right, somebody else's capacities, right? There are somebody else's executive capacities that are going to be activated, right, in that process. So again, so this all gets to a point about, right, the process type is going to be the wrong process, is going to be the wrong type. in particular, what I say is that we don't have the satisfaction of what I call an endogenous guidance condition, right? So we have an endogenous initiation condition that's satisfied. The agent initiates, right, the process of making up their mind, right? They have an intention to do something. I think that happens in Paraboom's case. I think that happens in the case of heteromesial causal deviance. But in both the case of case one in the direct in the four-case argument, and in the case of heteromesial causal deviance, the agent is not guiding the process. Someone else is guiding the process. Ultimately, it's somebody else is setting the goal, the end, and they're doing what they know they have to do in order to ensure that that outcome is being realized. And because of that, the agent's not guiding what they're doing. And I take it that guidance is going to be central, right, for us to be exercising agency. That's the influence of Harry Frankfurt's The Problem of Action on me from 1978. Right. That is just such an important paper. And and I think, and that's really informing a lot of what's going on there for me is Frankfurt's idea there about the centrality of guidance. Right. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question. No, and I even left out quite a bit about how causal powers figure into all this and everything else. So
Well, we'll have to point people to your work. I'll have to go check it out. That's really interesting to me. And I guess given the way you talked about how, Paraboom gives this series of cases and then asks, where's the difference? Where's the relevant difference between any of these cases? So far, it seems like clear difference between case one and case four, the ordinary deterministic scenario. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what you'd say about the intermediate cases, and especially case two, which doesn't have as direct, it has more distal intervention by the manipulators, as you mentioned earlier. Maybe you could also say something too about the zygote case from Al Mealy. We've talked about the zygote argument too on the podcast. So when you have this goddess Diana creating this zygote, knowing in this deterministic universe it's going to develop into this agent Ernie, who 30 years later is going to do some action that Diana wants him to do. There, it's very distal, it seems, and I wonder if you think a similar kind of line will give you a similar result in that case, or whether you want to take a different approach.
Yeah. So my response, the kind of response that I'm giving to Paraboom's four-case argument, particularly with case one and case four, and arguing there's a relevant difference, is an example of a kind of soft line reply, right? For your listeners who may or may not be familiar with that kind of language, where you try to show that there is a relevant difference.
Right.
Now, when it comes to cases 2 and 3, right? Case 2 is there's the case of distal sort of bioengineering, if you will, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? The person's engineered to do this, and that's what you have in the case of the zygote argument. Right. And then, case 3, where it's a kind of, Walden 2 type scenario, right? Where you've got kind of behavioral engineering. When I think about those sorts of cases, whether it's the zygote case or case 2 and case 3, I tend to think that Michael McKenna's strategy is the right one, which is that's where you now go for a hardline reply, right? Yeah. And you start looking at the case of causal determinism, right? And you say, all right, what's the relevant, right? So is this an agency preserving relation or not? Mm-hmm. And my answer is, yeah, it is. and then I look at case 3 and case 2, and I don't see a really relevant difference. Now, facts about the cases, I think, should lead us to treat those agents differently when it comes for the purposes of how we respond to them, when it comes for the purposes of punishment and blame and so on. But when I start thinking about, A, whether what they're doing is intentional, the answer is yes, whereas I don't think in case 1 it is. Mm-hmm. And B, is it free? I think they're satisfying compatibilist criteria. So I think it's fine. So, But I'll say something about the pathway to compatibilism. I once upon a time I was a libertarian, and I only became a compatibilist because of reading John Bishop's book Natural Agency.
Oh wow!
And it was actually, I remember it was the first time I met Bishop, and I actually got convinced I'm on my flight to the APA in San Francisco, and I was going to meet John for the first time. It was my final year in graduate school, and I was finishing the last part of that book on the plane, and I just thought about it more and more. And what he's doing in that book, I think a lot of people lose it. They miss what's going on. John's ultimate concern was actually with moral responsibility, moral agency, and free agency. Yet everybody focuses on what's going on in the latter half, where it's all just foundational action theory stuff, and then that narrative gets lost, because by the end of the book, he's no longer really talking about free will at all, but and moral agency, right, and moral responsibility. Yet I'm reading the book and I'm like, wait, what's the relevant difference between having a causal process that's deterministic or indeterministic for the purposes of agency? And it just wasn't clear to me that there was any difference. It's just a question of whether or not I've got something that is probabilifying a particular outcome versus necessitating it. Mm-hmm. And that just didn't strike me as being sufficient, right? Because unless you want to posit, and here's where I'm going to agree with Dirk Pereboom, unless you want to posit, right, certain sort of special agent causal powers, I don't know if having that indeterminism is going to be enough to really make any sort of a significant difference. So that's my conversion. Literally, it's instead of a road to Damascus experience, it's a flight to San Francisco experience. and I came around with that. So that's now to say, then I look at those cases and I just go, is there intentional agency here? Yeah. Okay, if there's intentional agency here, it looks to me like, right, unless I've got some reason to think differently, it looks like I've got some free agency here as well, right? And this is where I think Helen Stewart's right? Helen Stewart, I think she's exactly right in her book Metaphysics of Freedom, where she's like, I'm saying that agency is not compatible with determinism. And I think that's exactly what you should be doing if you're an incompatibilist. You should go, in this case, right, it's kind of it's a hardline reply to the compatibilist, if you will, right? It's sort of like, all right, you want to say that you've got agency here and you've got freedom? I'm going to tell you, you don't even have any agency, not even intentional agency here, when you've got a deterministic process. And that seems exactly like what I think one ought to do if one wants to really stick their neck out and defend libertarianism and defend incompatibilism, is go that route. I think it's a sort of bite the bullet, strong, sort of, some might even regard it as an extreme strategy. But I think if we think about these issues about intentional agency and free agency as being of a piece with one another, we ought to, I think, reach the kinds of conclusions that she does, or at least, that's where she starts, and she's of course defending that. But I think it's a conclusion, obviously, she reached as a result of her research. So, so that's why I said, for instance, earlier that I said I think, for listeners, pair up John Bishop's Natural Agency with Helen Stewart's book, because I think those two, read back to back with one another, present they radically contrasting pictures. Right. But both of them are up to the same thing. They both care very deeply about moral responsibility and free agency. Yet they think that there are these fundamental questions about intentional agency that we can't ignore. And how we answer those questions is going to make all the difference in the world for where we're going to come down in these debates. So again, there's going to be some event causal libertarians out there who are going to not be very happy with that sort of way of framing things. But I think that's, in any case, I think that that these things are really much more of a piece than a lot of people want to think of them as being. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. Well, are there any potential objections to your argument that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I mean, the main argument, the main objection that I could think of is, where people will just bring up just standard cases of the presence of a prosthetic, right? And why isn't that making a difference, right, in this sort of case? And here I would turn to the point about functional integration. So that what I'm going to look for now is, right, is that thing, is it a one-off thing, right, that's happening, or something that's only happening when somebody wants something to happen? So Barrett Ench, in his book How We Act, I think hit upon, one of the things that's going wrong in these cases of heteromesio-causal deviance is that, right, the agent, or if you want it to be some impersonal prosthetic that is, right, is designed to actually always execute, right, the intentions of some designer or whatever, that in that sort of case, the thing in question, the object, the artifact in question is not integrated within the system, right? If it were integrated, it would be something that's always responding, right, in the way that, right, in this case, the larger system, right, intends to, right? So it'd be something that would then be reliably integrated and would be doing, right, generating particular sorts of outcomes in accordance with that. So the presence of a prosthetic like this in case one, I think, or prosthetic or whatever the kind of device is, whatever the mechanism is going to be whereby we end up exercising control, is it's always in the service of the ends of another kind of system that has an intention that, right, the agent does something. And in that case, it doesn't seem like it's functionally integrated. The way it's not like my heart is like, as an analogy, right? If my heart only beated when somebody beated. Wow, I'm speaking like my son right now. If my heart only beat, right, when someone wanted it to be beating, it's not functionally integrated within me as a system, right? It's not doing, it doesn't have the role of a heart, right? In that case, right? It's just this thing that is this standby that every once in a while beats, pumps the blood through my body, and maybe I'm not even alive. I'm just some organism that's just sitting there with this organ that ends up beating every once in a while. That's not going to be something that's playing any kind of role within, again, a system that we could describe as integrated in the sort of way that I take it is going to be characteristic of systems that are agents, right?
Right.
And I think that's what's missing in those sorts of cases. That's the important difference, I think, between a generic prosthetic and what we've got in case one. So let me mention something else, though. And so that is that. So Paraboom, right? So Dirk has a kind of reply to, I think, these sorts of worries about the presence of another agent. But his response that he gives, and so this is at the end of his paper. Let me find this here. So he says, look, there's nothing really terribly unique about this, right? And he gives this example of, where is this case? Right, he says, agency is regularly preserved in the face of certain involuntary, momentary external influences, right? He says, finding out that the home team lost can cause one to reason and behave more egoistically and less charitably. News of winning a prize stands to make one reason and act more generously, but the conditions of agency remain intact. So apparently what the thought is that what you've got, something like case one and these other cases, is similar to that kind of case. And they strike me as radically dissimilar, right? It's not in the case that anybody on the home team intended that you're going to get angry, right? And they knew that by doing this, right, by losing, we're going to lose, we're going to get that guy pissed off, right? And he's going to start beating up on people in the stands, right? That wasn't their intention. Nobody is sitting there, right, with an intention that you're going to you're act in a certain sort of way, knowing that their action is going to bring about that particular outcome. So there, I think there's a really, really important difference between what's going on in his first case there and what's going on in any of these other sorts of cases where you might be influenced in a way that is causally determinative, right, of a particular outcome. Those are not cases involving somebody else's intention, right, in the process, right, and ensuring a particular outcome, and they know that by this particular means they're going to guarantee that outcome. So.
Yeah.
And if anything, actually, I think there's an interesting parallel between this and what you have with things like theological. Going back to the theological case that I started with, I wasn't thinking about this with this, but I think that now you get to somebody who's a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, let's say, and they're a theological compatibilist. I don't think compatibilism helps them one bit, right? Compatibilism as a theory of free agency, because it's manipulation, right? If you've got divine manipulation, unless it's a case of now the universe, things being structured in a sort of way in one's environment. But in the sorts of cases that oftentimes we have, particularly look at somebody like Calvin and some of the people who were most influenced by him, is they're like, no, God was hardening the person's heart, right? Ensuring that they're going to act in a certain kind of way, right? God is ensuring that Judas is going to do this. And now, right, appealing to compatibilism to help out is like, it has that, there's a kind of icky kind of, I just don't think it's there's the ick factor, which is like, oh, what, is that a being worth worshiping? I don't think so. But then secondly, I just don't see it working. That's not, again, compatibilism is supposed to be, as I see it, at least as it's formulated, right, in our sort of late 20th century, early 21st century context, is a thesis about impersonal causation, right? And not, right, the activity of another agent. And that's where I don't see, compatibilism helping out the theological determinist, right? I think they're definitely they're not of a piece. I just want to make clear to any listeners out there who are interested in free will and theology. I think a lot of compatibilists, particularly those of us who are causal theorists, are going to be very uncomfortable, right, with the thought that somehow compatibilism is going to give them a get out of jail free card, when it comes to this problem of providence and particularly a certain kind of providence, right, risk-free providence, right, and human agency. So.
Yeah, we just actually had an episode at the end of our last season kind of exploring those questions and
I was aware of that. That's
the objections. Yeah. I think I don't know. To me, it seems like it's going to make a difference whether you want to take a hard line or soft line in response to some of these manipulation challenges. And if you're okay with more hard lines than soft, it might not be, might not be so bad to appeal to compatibilism to kind of bring the views all together.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to disagree with Michael, though. So
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think case one is just there's no agency, right? That's it. Well,
Yes,
there's agency. Right. There's agency, but it's not Plum's.
That's right. Yeah.
It's the neuroscientist's agency. That's whose agency is. That's the agency that's actually being manifested in that case, right? Not his own. That is to say, not Plum's. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Andrei. This has been excellent, and I'm sure lots of people are going to want to follow up with the episode with reading more of your work. So where can listeners go to follow what you're working on now?
Probably the best place would be my Phil People profile. So yeah, if you just go to Phil People and just put in my surname, I'm the only philosopher with that name. So
right.
So it'll be easy. Yeah.
Thanks again, Andrei.
Thanks.
In our next episode, we'll talk with Megan Fritz, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock.